Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of the day it is that you happen to be checking out this podcast. My name is John. I'm the lead pastor at Coram Deo Church, and I'll be your host once again. Sorry to disappoint. The only host we've ever had, but I'm working on that, sort of. But I'll be your host today on The Blitz. It's coming. We are approaching the end of June. That is the end of what has now become known as Pride Month. And our church has released some helpful blogs. Pastor Ryan wrote two, and Pastor Rustin has also written two. And I've done a couple podcasts. This is going to be my final one. And the previous podcasts were more focused in terms of the content. And what I want to do is I want to step back and I want to address the issue of LGBTQIA+. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to remember all those and get them right every single time. But I want to address it from 30,000 feet, and I want to respond to a question that I have heard, and I anticipate you've heard, and maybe you have this question, and that question is this: what is going on? What is going on? We have witnessed significant change, unprecedented change, meaning the things that are changing are not minor in nature. They are significant. We're talking about the definition of a man and a woman and marriage, and we're talking about the transgression of all pre-existing sexual norms and boundaries. It is a profound change, and it's not just a significant change, but it is quick change. It was just a couple years ago the Supreme Court of our country made same-sex marriage the law of the land, and we've gone from that to gender reassignment, drugs and surgeries for minors, for kids. Like that's where we're at right now. And so there is a rapid pace to this change. And then you also have to notice that the change is widespread, meaning it's not just one little group in a corner who's championing this ideology, but it is everywhere. It's in the local schools. It is major American corporations. It's also down the main street of local towns. It's in the government. It's everywhere. So the degree is unprecedented, the pace of it is unprecedented, and the breadth of it is unprecedented. So what is it? What is going on? How are we to understand this? So I want to try and answer that question. What's going on? I'm going to answer it again from 30,000 feet, stepping back, and I'm going to try and make this as accessible as possible, which means I'll have to speak in some generalities, okay? So forgive me for that. If you want me to be more specific, I can be more specific at a later time. If you want to ask a question, submit a question or whatever. But I'm going to speak in generalities for the sake of brevity. So what is going on? Okay. So one of the things we need to do is we need to step back a little bit and understand the way that we have thought about issues. Okay. So hypothetically speaking, let's consider this. If you had a friend and that friend said, you know what, I don't believe in gravity. Or let's say your friend said, I don't identify as an object that is subject to the rules of gravity, the law of gravity, okay? Now, your friend may be free to say, I don't believe in gravity. And they may be free to claim that they don't identify as a person who is subject to the laws of gravity. They can say those things and they can believe those things. But that doesn't free them from the laws of gravity, okay? They're still subject to the laws of gravity, meaning no matter how much they believe, no matter how deeply or genuinely they are convinced, or how strongly they identify as a person who is not subject to the laws of gravity, if they walk off the roof of their house, they are going to fall, right? Because what they believe cannot change reality. They are still subject to reality. And so most of us, we understand this in the physical world. We understand that what you believe about gravity matters, that it makes a difference, and that your belief or lack of belief or your identifying as whatever doesn't change the laws of gravity. You are still subject to the laws of gravity. We believe that is objective, that you can't undo that. No amount of belief can undo that. No amount of medication can undo that. No, right? You're subject to these physical laws. We believe, in other words, in the physical world, we believe that things are more objective, that they're true, and that they don't change, okay? Now, we don't have that same type of belief when it comes to spirituality. So on the one hand, we may be deeply concerned about what somebody believes about gravity, hence the person who doesn't believe that gravity exists and they jump off of a building because they don't believe it, where we'd be very concerned about the consequences of their faith or their profession or their lack of as it relates to gravity. We would be very concerned about that. But if that person said, I don't believe in God, right? Or I believe in a different God than the God that is revealed in the scriptures, than the God who is the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. If they said, I don't believe in that God, and I don't believe in the Bible, and I don't believe in the gospel, and I don't believe in Jesus, we would see that as, there's a temptation to see that as an inconsequential statement or a confession, okay? So if they don't believe in gravity and they act on that belief, we understand that will have consequences, significant consequences to it. But if somebody says, I don't believe, we tend to think that's not going to affect them in the way that not believing in gravity would affect them, okay? Or in other words, we believe that the physical world is more real than the spiritual world, right? We believe that the physical world is more real than the spiritual world, meaning if you're not in line with the way things are in the physical world, it will have dire consequences for you. But if you're not in line with the way things are in the spiritual world, that's really up to you, right? It's every man for himself. If you want to believe whatever, it's okay with you. That's the way that many people have thought about religion. That's the way many people have thought about faith in God and spirituality. And that is one of the problems, that we think that the physical world is more real and the spiritual world is less real objectively, when in fact, the opposite is true. God is spirit, and he existed before the physical world. The physical world and the laws of nature, which are simply the expression of God's sovereignty over things, those things are not eternal, meaning that they did not always exist. They are part of a created world which derives its existence from God, who is spirit, okay? So God existed before the physical world. There was a spiritual reality before there was a physical reality. So at the very least, the spiritual world is as real as the physical world. But if you read authors like C.S. Lewis, and he talks about the Great Divorce and how heaven is a more real world than the earth. So what I'm saying here is one of the big problems is that we have assumed that the physical world is more real than the spiritual world, when that is not the case. That's not the case. And so how you function in the spiritual world, what you believe, has massive consequences, in the same way that what you believe about gravity has consequences. What you believe about running your car into a tree at 50 miles an hour has significant consequences, and what you believe about the existence of God and who he is and whether or not Christ is his son, that also has massive, massive consequences. So one of the problems is that we have minimized the importance of spirituality, And we have maximized the importance of the physical world, and therefore we have done great spiritual harm to ourselves collectively as a culture, okay? Because we are living as if there are not consequences for our spirituality, when in fact, like in the real world with things like gravity, there are consequences to our spiritual decisions and our allegiances and what we trust in and believe in and how we practice. That world is real, and there are real harms that we bring upon ourselves when we do not live rightly in terms of our spirituality, okay? So again, this is 30,000 feet, this is big picture, but that is one of the big issues, okay? Now, part of that issue has to do with the rejection of God, okay? So when you reject the gospel, when you reject the God of the Bible, when you reject Christianity, when you reject the scriptures in the church, okay? When you reject God, you don't end up with something that's neutral. You don't end up with no God. There's a saying that nature abhors a vacuum, right? We don't like something being absent. And so when you reject God, you don't get atheism, right? You don't get a world in which there is no God. When you reject God, you end up with a different God, right? This is a basic principle in the scriptures. There is belief in God and there is belief in demons. There is a kingdom of light and there is a kingdom of darkness. There is no kingdom of in-betweenness. Okay, so when you reject God, you don't get pluralism, you don't get neutrality, you don't get vague, harmless spirituality. When you reject the God of the Bible, what you get is a different God. That is something that many people did not bank on and many people do not understand. They think that they can reject God and just go on living without some sort of God. But there is always a replacement to God. Human beings are such. We are made in the image of God. We are made to worship God. It is intrinsic to our existence and our identity. And therefore, we will always worship something. We will always give ourselves to something. We will always cling to something or someone. There will always be a God, right? And whether that God is named or whether that God is directly known, right? That will vary, but there will always be a God. So when we reject God, we don't end up with nothing. We end up with a different God. Now, we'll take that a step further. The God of the Bible is a God who creates, and when he creates life and order and structure. So in the very beginning of the Genesis account, there is stuff, matter that is created, and that stuff is void, right? And there's no order. It's empty and it's void and it's lifeless. And the story creation, the story of creation, which unfolds over 6 days in Genesis 1, is the story of God bringing form and fullness of life to a world that was without form and was void, right? It was without form and void. So the God of creation takes something that is without form and void and he gives it form and then he fills it. That is to say that he creates order. So you see the order in the sun and the moon that are governing the day and the night. There is the air, the atmosphere, and then there is the earth. There is animals in these different spheres. There's birds that fly around in the air. There are animals that crawl around on the earth. Then there is water. And when God creates, he separates water from land. He creates order and he creates boundaries. Land is not water. Water is not land. There are certain things that go in the water. There are certain things that go on the land. And at the end of the creation story, God creates Adam and Eve in his image, male and female. He created them. They are to be fruitful and to multiply and to have dominion over all of the earth, meaning they are to extend and multiply this order. So the pattern is God creates, and he creates with order, and he fills it with life, and then he gives Adam and Eve the job of imitating him or imaging him as they create life, and they bring order and form until the glory of God covers the entire face of the earth. Okay, so that's the creation story in which we see we get a glimpse of who God is, what he's like, what he does, and what he wants for humanity. Order in life, okay? Structure, boundaries, this, not this. This is land, this is water. The water stops here. Male and female, multiplying, reproducing, being fruitful, extending dominion, and governing over the earth. That's what God does. Now, when you reject that God, you don't just reject him, but you also reject his order. All right, let me say that again. When you reject the God of the Bible, you don't simply reject him and retain his order, but you reject him, and you also in rejecting him, you reject his order. And so when you reject God, there's an inevitable thing that starts to take place. You start to lose distinctions. God creates distinctions. He creates boundaries. When you reject God, you start to lose distinctions. Okay? That is to say that the lines between things gets increasingly blurry. What is good? What is wrong? That line gets blurry. What is male? What is female? That line gets blurry. What is the role of government in society? What is the limit of that? What is the role of the family? Those lines start to get blurry. When you reject the God of the Bible, you also reject his order, and you reject the good distinctions that he has made. Also, when you reject the God of the Bible, you reject the life-filling nature of not just God, but the things that he commands. God is filling a place with life, right? That's what's happening in Genesis. When you reject that God, you're rejecting the idea of filling things with life. So rather than filling things with life, you end up taking life away. That is one of the inevitable consequences of rejecting God. So you lose distinctions, good, bad, right, and wrong, family, state, male, female, and you lose life. You start to celebrate death as if it's a positive thing. And we see that so clearly right now with what's being touted as reproductive rights, which is just the murder and the dismemberment of innocent unborn children. That is an inescapable reality. That is an inescapable consequence of the rejection of God. Because when you reject God, you also inevitably must reject his order, his standards, and you must also reject his activity, which in Genesis, he's filling with life. So when you reject him, you'll end up not filling with life, and you'll end up just taking life. Okay? So back up a little bit. We've assumed that the physical world is more real than the spiritual world. That has brought upon spiritual harm. That harm comes because we have rejected God, thinking that we'll end up with neutrality or pluralism or atheism. But what we really end up with is another God, right, that is behind the curtains, an idol, a false idol. And because we have rejected God, we have rejected God's order and the distinctions, and also that impulse to create life. We lose all of those things. Now, one question that I would anticipate is, if that's the case, why does it take so long to get here, right? Does somebody reject God and then automatically all those things happen? Well, the answer to that is no. That's not how it works. Cultures, you got to think about this not just as an individual, but as societies and as a culture and as a country. We have been on this trajectory for a while, but the way things have come around has been somewhat recent and has been very fast. And I think there's a way to understand this. Okay, so if you can remember way back in the day, before we were all using Apple Pay and credit cards for everything, they used to have these things called checks, and you could write a check when you go buy anything at the grocery store. And this meant you didn't have to have money on you, but your money was in the bank, right? And you wrote a check, and the check was issued from the bank, and you signed it and put the amount on it. And then the grocery store or the coffee shop or whatever could take that check to the bank, and those funds would transfer from your account into the account of the business owner, right? It was a very convenient way of doing things, okay? However, if you started writing checks for more money that you had in the bank, okay? And let's say you started this on a Friday afternoon. So the banks were closed for the weekend. On Friday, you could have wrote a check for $100 when you only had 10 cents in your account, right? You could have wrote that check and you could have gotten that product. And you could have gone the next day, you could have gone clothes shopping, or you could have gone to get a new phone or a new computer or whatever it is that you wanted to get. And you could have written a check for that as well, knowing that you had no money in the account, but you wrote the check. And guess what? The business person, the vendor, the store, they accepted it. And then you're like, man, this is great because I just keep writing these checks and I keep getting things that I'm not paying for. And so you go through all of Saturday and you're writing your checks. And you're like, this is great. I keep getting my stuff. And then Sunday rolls along and, the banks are closed, so no one's cashing their checks. And you go Sunday and you're writing your checks and man, you keep getting exactly what you want for it. And so you go to the dealership and you write a check for the dealership, for a car because you want to buy this car to replace your old car because, gosh, you just have to write a check, right? Monday's going to roll around and those checks are going to hit the bank account, and the bank is going to realize, all right, there's checks coming in that are insufficient funds. Those checks are going to be denied. They're going to bounce, is what we used to say. And you know what? The people who sold you that stuff, they're going to come back and they're going to want it, and they're going to want it with a penalty on top of that, okay? I say that to understand that our culture has been writing checks, so to speak, checks that we don't have the funds to cash or to pay for in the account. But those checks are starting to bounce. And they're going to continue to bounce. And when they bounce, there are drastic consequences. Okay, right now, we're seeing some of the consequences. Culturally, this is what happens when you reject God. Those checks are bouncing and society is crumbling. Culture is crumbling. Things are falling apart. And as long as those checks keep being written and keep bouncing, you're going to see continued, ongoing societal disintegration, right? Things are going to keep breaking down. What's happening right now in our country with the banking system is an economic expression of what's also happening in terms of medicine and gender and education and society at large. It is disintegrating, and it is one of the things that has to happen. It's an inescapable thing when you exchange the truth of God for a lie and you adopt a new God as your God, and that God, who is not a God of order and not a God of life, is calling the shots for an entire culture. That culture will not be a culture of order and will not be a culture of life, and it will look increasing like the culture that we have right now. Now, so 30,000 feet. That's what's going on. That's how we got here, and that's what's happening right now. Now, as I end this, I'll also say these judgments that we're seeing, the consequences that are hardwired into the rejection of God, are also part of God's grace. Because God has created reality in such a way that when we live in opposition to God, reality, right? There are consequences to it, right? So just like if you jump off the roof of your house, there's a consequence to it, and if you learn from that consequence, you'll no longer jump off the roof. You'll realize that identifying as a gravity-free person is really ridiculous, and you're better off just living under the laws of gravity, right? The judgments that we're experiencing are actually God's grace, because God is revealing to us as a culture, as a country, that the God that we have exchanged God for, and the things that we are believing and the way that we're living is not sustainable, and it can't bring happiness. It can't bring flourishing. It can't bring human life, right? We're seeing that right now. And so one of the things that I try to, as much as I can, remind myself is that the checks are bouncing right now, and that's God's grace telling a people to repent. This life doesn't work. This ideology doesn't work. This revolution destroys. It cannot sustain. It cannot bring order. It cannot deliver what it promises. And in that, there's a pain. There's a real pain, an emotional pain, a physical pain, a spiritual pain, but it's meant to be corrective. It's meant to wake us up to the reality that what we are seeing and witnessing and experiencing is the consequence of the rejection of God. This is what happens when you reject God. And what that does is it helps Christians like myself, and I'm assuming you, to understand the way forward. What is the way forward? Well, the way forward is not capitulation to the revolution, right? We can't do that. The way forward is to stand firm and to hold fast to our confession of faith. We get this in the writings of the Apostle Paul, specifically in 2 Thessalonians, which I'm prepping a sermon on right now. We have to hold fast. Even when the culture says that holding fast to Christian doctrine is hate speech, we have to hold fast. Even when the culture says that we are bigots for believing what we believe, we must hold fast to the truth. We cannot capitulate to the movement. We cannot try to Christianize the movement. We cannot, what I mean by that is finding a way to, with our whatever Christian jargon, bless this movement. We have to hold fast to our confession, to our doctrine. We have to preach the gospel. And the only thing that pulls us out of this moment is essentially revival. A widespread repentance, a turning away from sin, and a turning to faith in God and His Son, Jesus the Christ. So what's going on? That's what's going on. We have acted as if the physical world is more real than the spiritual world. We have rejected God, thinking we would get pluralism and secularism, but we have gotten another God. And the God that we are currently worshiping is not a God of order, not a God of distinction, not a God of life, and therefore everything is horrifically confusing right now. We are seeing the disintegration of culture, of economics, of medicine. We are seeing the disintegration of the human being, male and female, because that's what the false gods do. And the way forward is faithful, clear, bold proclamation of the gospel. So that's what I think's going on, and that's what I think will get us out. And with that, unless something crazy happens in the next week or so, which, it might happen, which would justify another podcast. With that, we're going to end the special series of Pride Month podcast on the Blitz. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you've got questions. Until next time, take care.